So it's my pleasure today to introduce the participants in the APSA Roundtable titled Avoiding Rupture in the Global Order, Is Pluralism Possible? This is being recorded on Friday, August 27th, just so people know kind of context of when this occurred. It's my pleasure. Let me just introduce myself, and then I will introduce the main participants in our session. I'm Alan Alexandrov, and I am the director of the Global Summitry Project. And that project you can find at globalsummitryproject.com. There you will find an e-journal on global summitry, the blog Rising Brixham, a series of different podcasts on global summitry, and increasingly a series of video interviews. And I also teach at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. It is my distinct pleasure, and I'm introducing folks in the order in which they're going to speak, my colleagues from across North America. And I'll start with Miles Kaler. Miles is currently the Distinguished Professor of the School of International Service at American University. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Global Governance at the Council on Foreign Relations. He has had a very distinguished career in international relations, and previous to his appointment at American University, he was the Rohr Professor of Pacific International Relations and a Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of California, San Diego. Susan Shirk, our second participant, is the chair of the 21st Century China Center and is a research professor at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. She's the director emeritus of the UC Institution Global Conflict and Cooperation. She previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State from 1997 to 2000, and was at that time responsible for China policy, Taiwan policy, Hong Kong, and Mongolia. She remains one of the most influential international relations experts on U.S.-China relations and elite China politics. Her best-known work, of course, Fragile Superpower, China, Fragile Superpower. Eve Tibergen, our third participant, is currently Professor of Political Science and Director Emeritus of the Institute of Asian Research. He's a faculty associate of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and co-director of the Center for Japanese Research at the University of British Columbia. He has just recently been named the Kanwaki Chair of Japanese Research at the Institute of Asian Research. And his most recent work is Elements in Politics and Society in East Asia. That's a Cambridge Elements volume. And the title is The East Asian COVID-19 Paradox. So quite a distinguished group of folks, and I appreciate their willingness to join us today. Recently, Miles wrote a piece in International Studies Review, actually a 2018 article called Global Governance: Three Futures. And he pointed out three alternative futures seem to have emerged: fragmentation, stagnation, and transformation. Emerging powers and some established powers have promoted new regional institutions, and I suspect principally in Asia, but elsewhere, that offer useful competition, but also the threat of fragmentation. In our opening session, or opening remarks actually for this roundtable, we identified, the rupture as a real possibility for global order. And we start with the notion that the rising tensions between China and the US, where do they conclude? How do they come to fruition? Does it lead to a largely bipolar world that we're going to see? What's the state of relations between China and the United States, and how threatened are each perceiving the other? It is clear that in addition, the anti-multilateralism and anti-alliance stance of the Trump administration has gone away, but we're not exactly clear what the Biden administration replacement for that approach is. We certainly have seen an effort on the part of the Biden administration to revitalize US alliances, the G7, the promotion of the Quad in the Indo-Pacific, and Biden efforts to promote a democracy versus autocracy kind of framing for global order relations. The administration acknowledged for US-China relations that there would be a determined competition, technological, economic, and political, and where necessary, confrontation, if called for, with China, but also room for collaboration. However, as my colleague in the China-West Dialogue, which we run out of the Global Summitry Project, my colleague is Colin Bradford, who is from the Brookings Institution. He's a non-resident senior fellow there. He recently wrote, the fact is that current mix of competition, cooperation, and confrontation in US-China relations is plagued by the fact that the dynamics of confrontation are dominating the other two pillars of the strategy and resulting in systemic conflict rather than a blended approach to China. The us versus them dynamic that is being expressed by the Biden administration, Biden foreign policy, seems to overpower the more productive channels of the relationship. A further kind of frame and context for global order right now is the failure of collaboration over the pandemic. Our colleague Eve Tibergen has recently written, the onset of COVID-19 pandemic overwhelmed our interconnected globalization. And the fundamental challenge today is the trade-off between connectivity and resilience, the latter being society's ability to bounce back from systemic shock, right? Finally, in looking at the global rupture, it seems to me we have two additional features. The failure to collaborate more generally in global order relations, and pointedly with respect to COVID-19, as we just suggested. And additionally, a real question as to how American policy goes forward today with the consequences of the chaos in Afghanistan and the failed effort of US policy in Afghanistan, now concluding after 20 years. So there's a whole variety of different features of the global order that seem to have emerged and need to be addressed. And I have every reason to believe they will be addressed appropriately in the next short while. So I'll turn it over to Miles to begin the view of the global order in today's context.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you for organizing this roundtable on avoiding rupture in the global order. Is pluralism possible? The roundtable, as Alan has pointed out, has been framed largely in terms of US-China relations, but given the presence of China experts on the roundtable, which I am not, let me step back a bit and make more general points, a few general points about the global order and what is labeled, for better or worse, the liberal international order. First, despite the claims of its critics on left and right, the liberal international order was always more pluralist in its acceptance of different economic and political models than is often allowed or argued. During the Cold War, this pluralism was driven by perceived strategic necessity. So the United States, for example, accepted statist economic models in its allies, such as Japan and France. It clearly accepted authoritarian regimes throughout what was called the Third World during the Cold War. And the global war on terror, post 9/11, reinforced this political pluralism. For example, see the United States' close relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is hardly a paragon of liberal democracy. The decline in pluralism and the convergence, especially on more liberal economic models, was driven, I would argue, not primarily by a normative and coercive Washington consensus, but by the choices of many societies, including China, India, Brazil, to liberalize their economies and participate actively in the global economy. And in some cases, such as Latin America, this was accompanied in the 1980s and 1990s by political liberalization and democratization. And the global outcomes, it's important to note, over the last few decades, in terms of economic and social development, were broadly positive. Now, following this observation, the liberal international order has had and continues to have many more supports than the United States, especially, but not only, its liberal democratic allies, Canada, Europe, Japan. Third, the United States, especially under the Trump administration, but earlier as well, is hardly the leading supporter in many ways of the liberal international order in all of its manifestations. Now, 10 years ago, we might be considering, and indeed I personally was considering, whether the large emerging economies as a group, the BRICS broadly defined, posed issues of pluralism in the international economic and political order. But their economic rise, particularly Brazil, India, and South Africa, has certainly encountered serious obstacles in the last 5 years. And as the Roundtable correctly suggests, it is China that poses major issues in defining the future international order, simply because of its greater economic size, much greater than any of the other BRICS, its central role in the global economy, its military modernization, coupled with its authoritarian political order. So the question I want to deal with in the last portion of my remarks is, does China present a level of divergence internally and externally that will force a redefinition of pluralism in the global order? Or to restate a question that was posed to this roundtable by Alan, what are the limits to pluralism set by international commitments and norms? And how does China speak to those? Economically, it seems to me China presents a difference in scale, but not in kind, to past industrialized powers. Now, that may be a controversial point for some, but it seems to me that state intervention in the economy on behalf of mercantilist ends is hardly new. Japan, of course, being a case in point in the 1970s and 1980s, and its ongoing conflicts with the United States during the Cold War. What may be different in the case of China, and here I defer to my fellow experts on expert colleagues on the panel, is the extreme difficulty in the Chinese case of identifying and sanctioning the intricate web of state supports that take place at the national, provincial, and local levels. There's also a difference in scale, once again. That means that the effects on other societies of China's economic policies are much greater and will have greater political consequences in the United States and elsewhere, as they have already had with the China shock of the first decade of this century. I leave aside the larger question, which some China hawks, and I certainly exclude the two experts on this panel from that category, some China hawks in the US raise, which is whether any economic benefit to China from international exchange should be discouraged, since it adds to China's military power. That, it seems to me, is an argument for extreme decoupling that is both undesirable and simply not feasible, given China's central role in the international economy. Now, a much more difficult set of issues, and I'll close with these, are political. And what are the limits to international pluralism on the political level? This is a difficult question, given the growing repression of minorities, ethnic and religious, and other forms of dissent in China under Xi Jinping. How do we respond to that? It seems to me this is much harder than the economic side of the equation, which is difficult enough. Well, first, I think we know, and I think most scholars who've worked on democracy promotion and human rights protection would concede, inside a large authoritarian state, it is very difficult to promote democracy or human rights from the outside, even when China and other governments clearly violate their own domestic commitments and international norms and agreements. Now, I emphasize that last clause because I think it's important when we raise issues of human rights that we emphasize China's international commitments and agreements, and not that they're not satisfying our view of what a liberal order or a liberal domestic order should be. Second, I think we could oppose the export of Chinese practices and its authoritarian model to the rest of the world. I'm sorry that Jessica Chen White cannot be here today because she has written on this issue directly. I know Susan has thought about this a great deal as well. It's a controversial point as to how much China is exporting its model, but certainly it seems to me we have every right to oppose the export of its authoritarian model or the instruments of authoritarianism that it may be exporting to other regimes. Third, we can certainly oppose Chinese meddling in our political life, including the lives of Chinese expatriates who live in the United States and other democracies, and including meddling via by cyber means and other means, of which China has probably been less prominent than Russia and other actors in any case. Fourth, we can enhance pluralism within China. And here I would make two cheers for engagement. I know engagement is certainly in Washington definitely not something one's to be seen as espousing these days, but I would argue it would be a disaster if we did not admit that we had a strong interest in a vibrant private sector in China, in continuing exchanges between universities and other civil society organizations with similar organizations in the United States and other Western democracies. So enhancing pluralism, even if we cannot promote democracy per se, is certainly within the scope of our possibilities and also in our interests. We can maintain a commitment to pluralism and avoidance of forcible intervention in our own policies. In other words, try to avoid hypocrisy as much as possible. And by all means, and this is my final point, I think we can recommit to the liberal norm, and I would emphasize it's a central liberal norm of self-determination. China interprets that norm as leave us alone, a kind of a sovereigntist interpretation of self-determination. But self-determination implies a domestic commitment to pluralism as well. Minority populations are not repressed or expelled. The future course of society is determined by its people as a whole. It seems to me self-determination must include that kind of definition of determination by the society or the people as a whole, not by a single party or a class. And in certain respects, you could argue that definition of self-determination is a more demanding standard than formal democracy, as we have discovered in the United States and other liberal democracies. Now, would the Chinese party state accept such an expanded definition of the liberal order as a more pluralist, you would say, definition of the liberal order in the way that I've described in political terms, which I think are the most sensitive aspects for the Chinese regime? I don't know if that's the case. It's not clear to me whether that would be the case, even if we become a little less intent on the micro-liberalism that the United States, the careful micromanagement of the internal affairs of other societies that sometimes the United States and other liberal democracies have focused on, and looking more at the macro-liberalism of self-determination. If not, can we step back one step further, and can we imagine an order that's based basically just on rules of the road, right, with very little normative content, designed pragmatically, that would allow for the liberal international order to be redefined, as John Gray has called it, an enterprise of pursuing terms of coexistence among different ways of life. And if that's the way, that very, very expanded definition of liberalism is the way we define the future order, would it be acceptable to the United States and other liberal democracies and their publics? So those are questions that I leave you with.
So Miles, just before I turn it over to Susan, I guess it's an interesting distinction here, and I'm not sure it has much meaning, but my tendency is to use global order in the face of the perspective that the earlier order, at least during the Cold War, was dominated and led by the United States, and kind of the liberal norms in presumption rules, but definitely US leadership. And I distinguish it from global order, where you see a whole variety of different states, and in which there are a very limited set of norms and rules that kind of now dominate in international relations. You still see liberal order as carrying right through the period post Cold War, post the unipolar moment, etc.
I would say I see it carrying through in exactly the same way, but I would certainly make the argument it's not all about US leadership. Now, how much it depends on US leadership is a controversial point. We sort of had a natural experiment in the case of the Trump administration for 4 years.
Yes.
But you raised that issue with the Biden administration even. And I think, Afghanistan, the current events in Afghanistan have raised this issue. I think there are more pillars to the liberal international order, both in terms of support from other countries and civil society organizations and other actors in the global politics, not international politics, but global politics, than many people give it credit for. And it has its shakiness, it has its moments of weakness, but it seems to me the number of actors who are in some ways wedded to at least some liberal principles, especially in the economic domain, is actually relatively large. And I think that includes China, frankly, in many ways. I mean, I don't think the private sector, the large private sector firms in China, as entwined as they are in the state, want to see a shutdown of the liberal economic order globally. I mean, that would be counter to their interests, it seems to me. It may not be counter to the interests of the party, but it seems to me there are interests in China, certainly, that have a strong stake in the future of an open international economy. The political side, as I said, much more complicated and much more difficult.
Okay, fair enough. So now let me turn it over to Susan for your remarks on these issues. Susan.
Well, I think my remarks are going to be kind of orthogonal to Miles's because they're focused mostly on China. And the question that has been preoccupying me, and I think many of my colleagues in the China field, as well as in the Biden administration, is can we shape China's behavior? And another way of saying it is is China influenceable? Or is it an implacable foe, an adversary following its own direction, the ambitions inside Xi Jinping's head, and popular nationalism or whatever else might be driving Chinese behavior? Or is it sensitive to costs so that it will pursue its national interests in a way that reduces international criticism, seeks a more positive reputation as a responsible power? Can we motivate some adjustment in Chinese behavior? Now, of course, we have to be very realistic, especially about domestic policy and actions inside China. And as Miles said, our experience has been that it's extraordinarily difficult to try to influence China's human rights practices from outside. And of course, many of the issues, hang on. Sorry about that. Many of the issues that now, or many of the Chinese policies and practices that we find most reprehensible, most alarming from our own perspective, are domestic ones from their perspective. The re-education camps and repression in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, the complete, kind of occupation of the Beijing regime of Hong Kong and the loss of Hong Kong autonomy, crackdowns on all sorts of organizations and individuals inside China. So that's a problem. But on the other hand, there are various international issues related to especially the Asia Pacific. There are economic issues related to fair competition inside China, things that I still believe are potentially amenable to negotiated solutions between China and the United States and other countries. So the question of whether or not we can still shape China's behavior really looms over a lot of our strategic decisions. And the Biden administration, one way of looking at the whole first 6 months or so of the Biden administration is that they were testing the proposition that the Chinese leadership is somewhat responsive to international reactions to their actions, and that therefore there is at least some prospect of a negotiated approach to some of the disputes. But what has happened is that during those first 6 months, the Chinese leadership has not taken advantage of the opportunity presented by a new administration to signal its flexibility to provide any kind of reassurance on this front. And so that is really disturbing. We have seen a regime that instead of trying to ease tensions with the United States, it has kind of doubled down on its hardline positions on maritime claims, as well as Xinjiang, Hong Kong, just the whole question of the origin of COVID. It's picked fights and put coercive pressure on Australia, one of our closest friends and allies in Asia. Military pressure on Japan, on Taiwan, India. We've got this bellicose rhetoric, wolf warrior rhetoric. And so isn't that it's really quite perverse if you think about it, because there was an opportunity here to have, if not a complete reset of relations with the United States, at least some increased stability in relations with the United States. So one question that maybe we should ask ourselves is, did we give it a fair test? Did the Biden administration give it a fair test? Did the Biden administration signal any kind of reassurance with China? And I really have some question about that. The tone of the administration from day one was really very harsh, almost as harsh as the Trump administration. And there was almost basically all the Trump administration sanctions on China of various sorts are still in place. There's been no adjustment in tariffs. I mean, it's big news just to hear that the Biden administration might extend tariff reductions on medical masks and gowns and equipment and things like that, which seems to be, kind of ridiculous that we're still talking about having tariffs on imports of medical supplies that help us fight COVID, protect ourselves from COVID. So visa policies, there's been no indication of really changing this, and very little expression of desire to negotiate things like journalist visas and some of the other issues that might be amenable to a negotiated solution. Also, of course, the Biden administration has used the China threat and the frame of strategic competition with China, national security oriented competition with China in an instrumental way to mobilize bipartisan support for our domestic spending programs that we're trying to pass in the Congress with very small margins. So a very difficult problem. Our president, Joe Biden, believes that bipartisanship is still possible and he's the man to achieve it. And of course, there's a kind of instrumental use of talking about we've got to do this because in the context of competing with our Chinese rivals or even adversaries. So there's, to actually get any negotiated resolution of disputes, you need some element of goodwill. You have to give the other side some promise of possibility of actually resolving disputes in a way that will be of some benefit to them. And one of the really serious negative fallouts of this kind of approach of the Biden administration in the first 6 months is not just that I don't think we can say that we've really tested the intentions of the Chinese side, because we haven't provided some of that requisite goodwill. But also, we've turned the Chinese public very anti-American. And a lot of this comes from the blaming of China for originating COVID and allowing it to spread, which of course we can lay at the feet of the Trump administration, not the Biden administration. But that attitude persists because there's been no outreach, no public diplomacy, no speech explaining our objectives. What are we really trying to achieve? So that means that Chinese propaganda and media control, and but not just that. It's also people who are actually reading the foreign press. They have concluded that the United States is so hostile to China and bent on containing China. So anti-Americanism has increased in a way that makes the negotiated resolution of disputes and keeping competition within bounds much more difficult when you've got that kind of public attitude. So, okay, so let's say the test was fair enough and China continues to behave the way it's been behaving. So what does this tell us about what's going on inside China? One of people like Jessica and I and others are somewhat concerned about the fact that we tend to hear only one voice from China. We only hear Xi's voice. We view China as a kind of monolith. But in fact, there are a lot of moving parts inside China. But what's happened is that under Xi Jinping, the system has regressed from collective leadership with limited checks on power holders to a highly centralized, personalistic dictatorship. Xi has defeated all his potential rivals by means of the anti-corruption and party discipline campaign. He is, and this is something we have to recognize, he's very popular with the public now. He is popular in large part because he's kept people safe. COVID, if you look at surveys, people have been doing surveys, And it indicates that COVID has improved Xi Jinping's popularity and the popularity of the central government with the public. And it looks like he is going to be ruling China indefinitely. As we head up into the 20th Party Congress in the fall of 2022, Xi is really in a very strong political position. So, what that probably means is that he is operating in a system in which there's such a premium on loyalty. He puts such an emphasis on loyalty, and signs of disloyalty are punished very stringently, so that everyone is competing, all the officials are competing to prove their loyalty to Xi Jinping. That means that we get two phenomena here, both of which may be explaining the serious overreach we're seeing by the regime, especially in the first 6 months. Namely, the echo chamber, the propaganda echo chamber, the information feedback is not operating effectively. People do not give Xi Jinping accurate information about the backlash to Chinese policies and what is happening on the ground inside China either. And second, because of the competition to prove your loyalty, we get a bandwagon effect in which subordinates are rushing to figure out what Xi's wishes are, carrying them out to the extreme, even to an extreme perhaps beyond what Xi Jinping himself might have wanted. So this kind of bandwagon polity that actually Avery Goldstein wrote about a long time ago in discussing the Mao regime may be explaining this overreach that we see, especially during the first 6 months. If that's the case, then we are dealing with a much more threatening China, especially if it's going to be with us indefinitely. And then the question has to be, how do we protect ourselves? How do we slow them down through containment policies? And, we need to make sure that if we are in a kind of quasi-Cold War situation with China, we're pursuing smart policies that will enable us to win this competition. And I have a whole nother bunch of critiques of current policies, which I think may make it difficult for us to win.
Well, thank you, Susan. Before I turn it over to Eve, I guess I wanted to raise this question with you. And it's kind of a two-header, I suppose, is one, do you think that China remains a fragile superpower? You wrote about it, and you certainly promoted that view. But in behind that, of course, is trying to understand, really the effort of the party, and particularly Xi Jinping, to centralize control. I mean, we heard in the last, week that Xi Jinping thought now is going to be taught to Chinese students all the way down to kindergarten. And one of my Chinese RAs suggested also that they've made English used to be mandatory in China's schools, at least in Shanghai, he was talking about. But they've decided it's no longer mandatory. Don't have to teach English anymore. And the replacement, in part, is Xi Jinping thought. So what is the party, and more particularly Xi Jinping, up to in all of this?
Well, I do think that the Chinese system is fragile, even though right now Xi Jinping dominates quite effectively. But the lack of any power sharing with other members of the CCP elite is really a political risk.
Mhm.
I mean, he's thrown a lot of his potential rivals in jail, but the people in the Central Committee, the Politburo, the Standing Committee, they're not getting any share of the patronage, and forget corruption now, but they really are bound to resent the lack of power sharing. So I think the greatest risk is from the potential for splits in the leadership. And this 20th Party Congress, if we hadn't had COVID, if Xi hadn't tightened his hold because of COVID in the lead up to the 20th Party Congress, I think there might have been some unpredictable occurrences. The way I put it, I can't tell you what will happen, but when it happens, I won't be surprised. And that means particularly within the party elite.
Mhm.
From the bottom up, the real fragility is the middle class. Do we really think China's growing middle class wants to educate its children this way, in a way that limits their opportunities for international education, international careers? They're spending more time learning ideology than they are learning what they need for modern careers. So, I mean, that's an exaggeration. But one of the reasons that the tutoring business is so, had grown so much in China is because much of Chinese education is really bad.
Mhm.
And, parents know that. So, I think there are a lot of risk points. And then, of course, the main one is that Xi Jinping himself, no matter how secure he may look to us, he doesn't feel secure.
Mhm.
And when you put so much pressure top down on people to declare their loyalty to you, you're going to suspect that everyone is simply
Disloyal.
exactly, which means that you ramp up the repression.
Mhm.
So it's a very, I don't think it's a stable situation for the long term. I think it will get Xi Jinping through the 20th Party Congress. He'll have his third term. And look, in other countries with different types of political system, third terms are always problematic.
Well, Eve, you've been hearing our colleagues. What are your thoughts on the questions we have before us today?
Yeah, thank you very much, Alan. And it's wonderful speaking after Miles and Susan, and I will not repeat many of the things about which I agree, especially on China. But I'm going to propose here a big picture, cognitive, interactive framework to discuss global order dynamics in a time of very rapid change. We call it disruption. and possible policy responses for that. So I'm going to do two things. First, a couple observations on key forces unleashed today and why they're sort of unusual. And then second, draw some implications to understand what's happening in the global order now. So I hope you can hear me well.
Yep.
So first, one keyword on COVID, as evaluated in my just new book, global governance performance during COVID-19, at least in 2020, was both indispensable and extremely poor. This is one of the worst cases of global cooperation at least in the post-Cold War period. And it stands in great contrast with 2008-2009, the financial crisis, but also the Ebola crisis or the H1N1 crisis on the health side, or even the AIDS crisis. Second, we currently witness a strange mix of enduring global interdependence. In many ways, global supply chains are still working. Firms have not dramatically changed their behavior or their supply chains, but we have this in contrast with decaying global institutions and eroding social and political support for that global interdependence in Europe and the US. So it's not a point of equilibrium, that balance between continued global economic trade interdependence and the eroding global institutions and political support creates a risk of rupture going ahead. What we call global order, the liberal international order, is actually a weak superstructure that was set up on top of the Westphalian state-centered system that emerged out of the European reality of the 17th century and inherited the LIO, that means inherited the legacy of the British Empire, but it was predicated on a Western-dominated world in the wake of colonization. So today, third point, we face at least three major disruptions that are very unusual in their interactions. First, in the 20 years from 2000 to 2020, we have seen the greatest shift in economic power since the late 19th century, with over 20% of global GDP shifting hands from developed economies to developing economies. And 12% of the 20 went to China. So that has led to the appearance of peer competitors with non-Western cultures and historical grievances. That includes China, but it's not only China. And by the way, COVID accentuated this, including increased trade dependence of Japan or Taiwan toward China during the COVID time, right? When we look at trade data. The second major disruption is this fourth industrial revolution with the acceleration of transformation across the board and with huge effects down the line. And then finally, the third major disruption is the climate shock, which calls essentially for a transition of the entire global economy by 2050. And in fact, much of it by the mid-2030s. And therefore, it could lead to new winners and losers and a complete redistribution of the leading countries and players in the global economy. Yet, of course, current disruptions also offer possibilities if foresight and smart policy are introduced. And I like, in this regard, the new book by Bina Venkataraman, former Obama advisor and MIT researcher. It's also an interesting moment to reread Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, reminding us that past civilization during times of disruptions and environmental shocks have survived only when they were able to pull together and around sort of key survival mechanisms. Fourth major force right now, we witness extreme polarization, and it has been measured to be even higher than in the wake of the Civil War in the US, the pivotal country at the heart of the global system. There is no more consensus on almost any issue related to global order, global institutions, or socioeconomic choices. Even democracy itself may be at risk in the wake of January 6th. Partisan win can trump institutional integrity. And so people outside the US in other democracies worry a lot about democracy in the US. And that's new, right? We never had that situation. One key feature here is the information system at the heart of democracy is beset by misinformation and conspiracies that hamper decision capacity in the early phase of adaptation to social media, which we are now. Psychologists have shown that digital technology and social media are part of a possible augmented mind, whereby we delegate some cognitive processes to those unstable tools. And then finally, final observations on the current forces. We face China, a rising great power, undergoing centralization of power, as mentioned by Susan, and greater social control, as well as it's the carrier of historically driven anger and unique norms. Its internal decision-making process is more opaque now than at any point since 1979. Yet we do know that Chinese actions are the results of at least three distinct drivers. One is internal CCP dynamics, which were very well described by Susan. Second is larger historical frames that go back centuries. And third is reactive tit-for-tat actions in the context of dominant mental frames. Separating the three origins is complex, and I would argue it's poorly done in Washington, because they are very different. You could have discussion with average Chinese middle class members who are not very excited, as mentioned, about the current CCP dynamics, and yet are enraged by certain Western actions because they read them through historical frameworks and narratives. So that those things can happen at the same time. So now, what are the implications in terms of building blocks for global order today? And the bottom line is we need to focus on cognitive frames and human decision-making. Everything is filtered. If we trigger the wrong filter, our policy may have the opposite effects of our intentions. And I would argue that, for example, Western policy and reactions in Hong Kong triggered the opposite effects of what we wanted to do with our policies. And so that's an example. So then I have 4 points. First, the current cognitive decision-making processes are shaped by cognitive defects, including the integration of unprocessed emotions, poorly controlled information cascades, groupthink, as well as group polarization processes, and self-interested, poor quality leadership under weakening domestic institutions. Kahneman, Sunstein, and Sibony in their new book, 2021, called this noise or defects in human decision-making. Price and Sicking, 2021, have shown how emotions and rationality interact actually in ways that we underestimate. And we must urgently be more self-aware of all this, because it's at the heart of many of the actions in the global order. Second, I'm struck by the huge lags and gaps between active mental frames and historical imagery driving public opinion and policymaking on the one hand in countries like the US or China actually, and reality in other countries and at the aggregate level on the other hand. There's also a lack of recognition of the extent to which symbolic and historical frames act as heuristics in driving policy responses in the age of complexity. For example, the West consistently underplays the extent to which notions of historic vulnerability drive Chinese aggressive moves, and in turn, how you deal with those if historic vulnerability is at the heart of some of those actions. This has led to ineffective or counterproductive policy moves. I'm also amazed by how decision makers in key countries act toward another without an understanding of how their action will be processed and responded to, and without strategic mapping of implications at time 2, time 3, etc. And this applies to more than one countries. It also applies actually to China. And yet we have to remember that getting to, if we follow the tit-for-tat channels to a full-blown war, as we can see in the 2034 scenario written by Admiral James Stavridis, would destroy the modern world as we know it and be very, very hard to control. Third point, from a higher perspective, what is needed on the basis of actual reality and facts in other countries is a combination of professional deterrence and guardrails and higher level planetary cooperation on existential threats, to quote Toby Ord's new book. This requires pulling away from wrong focus on ideology. And I want to quote here JFK's June 1963 commencement speech, which really came in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis and was his reaction to it. So it started with, what kind of peace do I mean? What kind of peace do we seek? Now the Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, etc. So there's that famous section. But toward the end, he said, reflecting on the Cold War with the Soviets, we're both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle in which suspicion on one side breeds suspicion on the other, and new weapons beget counter weapons. We must deal with the world as it is and not as it might have been. And finally, if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. And those were lessons from Cuba, from the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that leads me to my fourth point. Globally, we witness today the rise of emotional and tit-for-tat policymaking and the demise of strategic thinking with clear objectives and clear endpoints. We even witness aggressive responses that build on specific historical frames and survival narratives. In response to this or that, for example, based on historical experience, so this is historic example, no matter what the cost, we have to do this, right? We see a lot of reaction of that sort, rather than strategic thinking, calculating costs, benefits, endpoint, consequences, etc. So on the basis of what I observe now, I expect actually a high likelihood of a Cuban Missile Crisis type of crisis, which would test everybody to the limit. And so finally, drawing on Kissinger's 2014 World Order book, I think we can say that we are at a time of complex global society, new technology, global economy complexity and interdependence, as well as major environmental shocks, all of which require a degree of what we call global order, that is minimal rules of the game. To get there, we must transition to a negotiation process where existing powers accept the return of non-Western traditions, and where key players must accept a pluralistic and diverse set of interests and cultural frames. And page 10, Kissinger, back in 2014, wrote this interesting sentence, which sort of summarized the key in the book. In our time, the quest for world order will require relating the perceptions of societies whose realities have largely been self-contained. The mystery to be overcome is one all people share, how divergent historic experiences and values can be shaped into a common order. And so I will close here my remarks.
A sudden closing, Eve. So before I turn it over to all of you, questions you may have of each other or thoughts arising from the discussion, I guess, Eve, the question I have is, it's very tough to reflect cognitive frames down to the practicalities of politics. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but it is difficult. And the question that arises, if you're looking at current Biden administration, and particularly in the face of what everyone would consider, I think, at least an immediate kind of disaster in terms of its foreign policy actions in Afghanistan, the question I have for you is, so what does the Biden administration do if it wishes to achieve a lowering of the temperature of the relationship with China and the improvement of the, as our friend Kevin Rudd talks about it, the guardrails, right, that frame U.S. China activity so that we are simply not driven by the tit for tat kind of framing that you suggest is what currently kind of dominates U.S.-China relations.
Right. So
what does the Biden administration do?
Yeah. Well, in this framework, first I would argue, following what Susan said, that the test hasn't been run yet. Okay. Because key words and key frames were used that sort of triggered the existential threat on the Chinese side. And so, and what you hear often when you hear from, Chinese on the cultural side, even middle class types of, they say there's this Chinese custom where, if you treat me as an enemy, then I'm not sitting down with you for compartmentalized discussion on something else, right? So are we enemy or not, right? So there is that sort of holistic there's a lot of cultural behavior that at least is operational at the more grassroots level. No, something else is a party in Xi Jinping. So for that is indeed, there's some other dynamics going on there. But so what it means is finding a ways, there's probably 3 to 4, 5 things that trigger the ultimate survival framework on the Chinese side. So probably you want to be very careful about those buckets. And then you can operate with a set of incentives and differentiated approach on different topics. But there's definitely, at least from the elites working on things like G20 or climate or even Afghanistan, there's probably room for understanding, right? But it requires diffusing certain frames. And it's odd what you hear sometimes from Chinese thinkers. For example, if there is a common action on Hong Kong, which for us is natural because they are breaking the rules, right? They read it through the framework of the Boxer Agreement, because there is a cycle of years as well where it matched the cycle of years. So everyone in the grassroots would understand, oh yeah, this particular year in the cycle of years where we exactly in the same as 1900, and here are the same 8 armies, trying to impose on us something. And that completely overwhelms the public opinion in that frame. So at least understanding those things, because we often underestimate how much public opinion constrains leadership, even in China. So understanding those things before acting is the step one, right? And to then separate issues in buckets. On the India, with the Greek completely that was, a cycle of loyalty, was very enthusiastic ground commanders that led to, very dangerous dynamics, right? So I don't see this as a strategic kind of calculation. Separation of issues and finding a ways to, to work with those frames.
Okay. Folks, turning it to you. Yes, Susan, a thought, question?
So, Miles, I was struck by what you said about avoiding hypocrisy. And one form of hypocrisy is talking about the liberal international order or the rules-based international order at the same time as we are imposing politically based restrictions on flows of capital, labor, and so we're kind of violating our market principles. The latest discussions in Washington, and not just in Washington, on Wall Street too, at the SEC, are restrictions in outbound investment from the United States to China.
Right.
So, I'm just so struck by how radical that is, especially given the scale of these financial flows. It's just seems kind of hubristic for the United States to contemplate that, or already to have actually enforced it to a certain extent. And so do you see that as a form of hypocrisy? I mean, are we ourselves violating the rules-based international order through these kinds of politically based and motivated barriers?
Well, a quick response to that is we've always had export controls for various reasons.
Yeah.
Now, I'm talking about the Huawei, that side of things, kind of technological connections to the military, and one can interpret that differently and argue whether those are politically motivated or motivated by reason of national security. But national security, as unfortunately the Trump administration demonstrated in trade, is a big loophole in all the rules-based economic order. They just blew that. I mean, people had stayed away from that justification for trade restrictions, and the Trump administration just blew that loophole gigantically bigger, which was really not in the U.S. interest, but there it is. Now, on the capital side, I mean, the one constituency left in the United States, as I see it, for China is Wall Street. They are in love with China. And capital flows, as many people have pointed out, despite all the talk of decoupling, have grown enormously to China. Now, what you're talking about, I think, are the SEC restrictions on listing in the stock exchange, but that's a regulatory issue that's been around for a while. And frankly, one could argue, maybe not so plausibly, that that's a protection for American investors. They should be investing in companies that have full transparency, and Chinese corporations listing on the US stock exchange have not had full transparency. So there's a big argument with the Chinese government about audits and whose audits should be used and the rest of it. I don't see that as particularly hypocritical. I think the tariffs and continuing with the tariffs is much more hypocritical in a way. And there, the Biden administration is foregoing an easy tax cut. I mean, because tariffs are basically a tax. So you could have an easy tax cut, which would be wildly popular with American business, but for political reasons, they're not willing to go there. I have to say, just briefly, I really found both you and Eve, as usual, I learned an enormous amount from your remarks, but I think everyone who works on foreign policy has to understand, whether it's China or another issue, that in Washington right now, the issues are domestic. Yeah. And everything is being driven by the domestic agenda. And frankly, I get a little bit not irritated with the two panelists here, but with the punditry in Washington, particularly the editorial page writers in Washington, because on the one hand, they say, oh, we have this threat to American democracy. We've got to do something about it, which after all was 6 months ago, January 6th. And on the other hand, why aren't we doing something about Afghanistan? Why aren't we dealing with China? Why aren't we doing this? Well, you can't have it both ways. If you think we need a strong domestic basis to go and do things in foreign policy, then we have to do those things. and that's what the Biden administration, I'm clear, I think that's what they've done. They basically put a lot of things on the back burner. Maybe that's unwise, but I think they're figuring if we can do the domestic agenda and get that in place, then we have a stronger basis going forward to deal with the rest of the world. And I think you have to understand, for once, a basically internationalist American administration is inward looking. And that is unusual. We're not going out trying to save the world anymore, even though Samantha Power is part of the administration, all these good liberal internationalists. That's not what's happening, I think. And so that's my interpretation. I do agree completely with you, Susan, that the trend toward a personalist dictatorship in China is a very dangerous thing. I mean, we know from comparativists like Jessica Weeks that they are the most dangerous authoritarian regimes for all the reasons you described perfectly. And I think that is a real concern. And going to Eve's comments, I would just like to make a final statement. Eve, you're absolutely right. But putting up guardrails, you described the post-Cuban Missile Crisis era in the Cold War. I mean, if that's where we are, then this larger positive agenda of cooperation, which is essential, like climate, is sort of completely to the side. So, that's a very pessimistic, avoiding the worst, I guess, is a good outcome. But I hope we can come to something better than that, because I don't see how we're going to deal with global health and climate and a host of other issues without China and the United States somehow reaching a modus vivendi, at least. But I think you both, to my mind, you both painted fairly pessimistic pictures. So
I just want to throw in, I thought it was really interesting that Janet Yellen's initiative about tax rates was moved so smoothly with the Chinese signing on.
Yes.
And it never became politicized. It never became, and yet it's kind of maybe a model for some other things that we could do.
Well, if you believe their shared interests, which I think both the U.S. and China have in avoiding tax evasion by their large corporations, it's kind of a win-win, as the Chinese would say. So whether climate is a win-win is an interesting question, right? Who makes the move, what moves they make, and global health, because of the poisoning of the waters by this argument about the origins of COVID, I don't think that's going to go anywhere, unfortunately. So.
Yeah, it is interesting, though, and coming back to the Biden administration and, this kind of tripartite competition, confrontation, collaboration, and my presumption at the moment, and certainly looking at the evidence, there's very, very little collaboration. If you look at, the meeting that Wendy Sherman had in Tianjin recently, and of course the Alaska meeting and so forth. I mean, it is interesting that the Biden administration, a simple step, could have, focused on the question of Afghanistan, not in the G7, but in the G20, and thereby bringing in to the discussion China, also bringing in Russia, but both of those have dramatically influential relations in that region. And yet the Biden administration chose the G7 as the, in quotes, the operative platform, trying to, kind of discuss where do we go from here on Afghanistan. So it remains to me difficult to discern what the collaborative policy that the Biden administration talks about is emerging, because I don't see it.
Right, Alan, on Afghanistan, for talking with some Afghan former diplomats here who are now on this side of the world, I think the G20 is not the ideal group either, right? Because you have too many relevant countries. What you need is an ad hoc group, but the ad hoc group has to involve the key neighbors and the key great powers. So, that actually means involving Russia and China in addition to
absolutely
Iran, Pakistan.
Well, that becomes
Turkey.
More problematic. But as a place to start, it seems to me the G20 is a better even if at the end of the day, not everybody kind of chimes in. That often the G20, is smaller elements drive initial direction. So I don't see that as a real problem.
But it's good and bad news here. But
sorry.
I just don't think the Biden administration or any U.S. administration feels that either Russia or China have been particularly helpful on the question of Afghanistan in the past. And in a way, what they're doing with NATO, and we can, you could argue about how it was handled vis-a-vis NATO, is saying to the regional powers who have not been very helpful, most notably Pakistan, well, now it's your problem. You are close to, you have borders with Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
Be our guest. And I'm not sure that's.
And moreover, they have, and they do have relations, obviously with the Taliban and apparently ISIS, but I mean.
And they have deep concerns about terrorism, both Russia and China. So.
Absolutely.
Right. So there is actually common interest, right? Actually, everybody is worried, and Afghanistan is ungovernable. It's very difficult to govern.
Absolutely.
And so if the great powers become rivals, it's going to be very hard to control terrorism. And so there is potential room for, sort of cooperative approach, but it's very, very hard to operate. We don't have the mechanisms.
Well, again, look, I mean, the folks who are the central players within the Biden administration foreign policy have talked about these things. It goes back to 2019 in the writings, competition without catastrophe. I mean, I could name all the stuff, all the pieces that they've written, be it Jake Sullivan or Anthony Blinken or any of the other folks. I guess my problem is I don't see the praxis. I don't see where the policy making is coming. I do understand, Miles, the notion that the focus has to be domestic, but you gotta, walk and chew gum at the same time. It's just, that's the nature of the global order these days. You can't just see one or the other. And
there are so many members of Congress just waiting on the Biden people for any hint of being soft on China.
Yes, absolutely true.
And
on both sides.
On the other hand, if we find common cause around the China threat, maybe we'll get some votes going our way for big domestic programs.
Yep.
So in a way, it all comes down to that. I would say.
Susan's absolutely right. It's very hard to find. I can't frankly name a single senator, for example, who would come out with a conciliatory statement about China or a cooperative statement about China these days. Even people on the progressive left side, I mean, because of the human rights issues on that side, and then on the economic side, I mean, once again, the business community, it seems to me, is relatively isolated in its interest in maintaining a cooperative relationship with China and reducing the tariffs and getting back to what they regard as normal. It's just not politically feasible at the moment. I think Susan is absolutely right. So, that's where Susan's point about the lack of feedback in China, I think, is a very dangerous thing. I don't think there's an understanding of how solid, too solid to my mind, of course, the consensus in Washington has become on the competition, rivalry, even adversary view of China, as opposed to a more mixed relationship. It's really unfortunate. So, and it's fascinating to me that in neither of the major political parties does big business really have a tremendous influence on China policy anymore. It seems to me, it's just not there.
Well, maybe we better bring it to a close. At least I need to go off and do something else.
And our audience, which may be limited, may also.
Well, I do thank all of you for being willing to come together and do this, even though it's kind of like, APSA, where is this all happening? But I thank you all. I really appreciate it. And I particularly appreciate all the remarks you've made. Are really quite insightful and deep. And so thanks again. And let me end with